So there's a section of the book of Isaiah that if you've been reading the Bible straight from the beginning, you might come across and say, I've read this before. Because it's in the book of Kings, almost verbatim, 2 Kings, describing sort of an encounter between Isaiah and Hezekiah.
Yep.
And then we find it again in the book of Isaiah. Now, I think we agree that it probably belongs originally to the book of Kings.
Yeah, because it's a prose narrative. It's much more in the style of Kings. There's nothing like this really in the book of Isaiah.
Right. It's a nice reminder, though, that the prophet Isaiah, whom we know from our book of Isaiah, was a viable character in the history. We're not sort of inventing Isaiah's prominence in the history of Israel, right? Isaiah made it into the big story, but we have this really almost verbatim correspondence between 3 chapters in Isaiah and in the book of Kings, but not completely verbatim.
Not completely verbatim. Now, I mean, the way they put together the book of Isaiah, they assembled materials. You know, they may have had some oracles of Isaiah, some kind of a testimony of Isaiah in chapters 7 and 8, and then they fill in gaps, and they go to the book of Kings. But as you say, it's very interesting because they don't tell us the whole story. Before you get into the common story, in the book of Kings, you have this passage. In the fourth, this is 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 13 and following. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib came up, and Hezekiah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish. Now Lachish was a little place not very far from Jerusalem. Shouting distance, you might say. I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. The king of Assyria demanded of Hezekiah 300 talents of silver, 30 talents of gold. Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. He stripped the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts and gave it to the king of Assyria. And according to the king of Assyria, who has also left us an account of this, he threw in a few of his daughters as well.
Right.
Now, you would never dream from the account as you get into the book of Isaiah that that's what happened.
Right. The notion of the king plundering the temple to pay off the Assyrian king, a little bit counter to, in a sense, Isaiah's message of just trust, right? Bribery is not really part of what Isaiah was advocating.
Now, you see, if you only read the account as you have it in the book of Isaiah, you think this is a classic example of the inviolability of Zion.
That's right.
The great Assyrian army comes up and they fail. They cannot capture Jerusalem because the angel of the Lord comes down and does his thing.
Right.
Now, but it turns out that before the angel of the Lord did his thing, the king had actually scraped the gold off the doorposts to pay him off. Now, for a time, when I was in graduate school, actually, the textbook we usually had was John Bright's History of Israel. And John Bright, following his teacher Albright, said there must have been 2 different invasions.
Right.
That there must have been one where Hezekiah paid him off, and then this wonderful, miraculous one.
Right. That somehow both got described in nearly identical terms otherwise around them.
Yeah.
Right.
I think people have pretty well given up on that.
Yeah.
No, actually.
I mean, this is a little bit like the way the Book of Chronicles whitewashes the story of David.
Yeah.
Right. Well, they take out the things that are not so pleasant, and we'll make it look a lot better than it may really have been. It seems highly likely, especially given the correspondence with Sennacherib's own records, that there was certainly some sort of transaction that took place that spared Jerusalem. But that's not really fitting with Isaiah's strategy here.
Yeah.
Before we go on, it's probably worth giving a tiny sense of the historical moments with Hezekiah and Sennacherib, which is what these chapters are about. At this point, right, Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, has decimated the entirety of the north, is gone.
Yeah.
And has now gotten around to the entirety of the south, right? Once Lachish is gone, right, that's the end, right? Jerusalem is the only remaining, essentially fortified city.
This is probably what we saw in chapter 1, where Jerusalem was left like the booth in the field at the end of the harvest.
That's right. Just isolated and utter emptiness all around it.
And the boast of the king of Assyria that he shut up Hezekiah there like a bird in a cage.
Right. So this is the sort of last gasp for Jerusalem. If it's going to be the end, it could very well have come here. But this is also, this is the climax of the story from the point of view of the biblical authors generally, right? Yeah. In Jerusalem, right? Here's the moment. It could go either way.
Yeah. And it's set up, maybe not quite as dramatically as the prophets on Mount Carmel with Elijah, but it's getting on that way. Mm-hmm. They have this Assyrian emissary comes up and speaks, and they ask him, please don't speak in Hebrew, speak Aramaic, so the other people won't understand it.
Right, that is Aramaic, the language that we officials speak to each other, right? We can have a private conversation, even shouting, as long as we do it in the official language rather than the sort of the native, the vernacular of the people.
They insist on speaking in Hebrew so that the general people who are going to suffer the consequences of this will hear about it. The gist of the argument is, has any God been able to rescue his people from the hand of the god of Assyria?
Right, and this is classic understanding of how war worked then.
Yeah. We
were fighting, but it's really our God is fighting against your God, and whoever wins, their God is mightier. Right, this goes back. This is how the Exodus is understood too. God says, "I defeated the Egyptian gods." So here we have, the Assyrians making a fairly strong claim. Especially look around, right? Look at all the other nations. Look at your own nation, right? Our God is simply the triumphant deity, and probably you should just admit defeat now and. Spare what you can.
Spare what you can, exactly.
Because what they're the speaking in the hearing of the people in the Hebrew is essentially meant to have a little insurrection, right? It's meant to convince the people to turn.
And it even throws in, didn't Hezekiah tear down a lot of the altars of your God? How do you expect that God to defend you?
Yeah.
Now, this, of course, is probably all written by a Judean, but even it could still be substantially authentic. If the Assyrians sent somebody up to taunt people in Jerusalem, they probably got advice first on what arguments would carry some weight. Mm-hmm. But then the king in this situation turns to Isaiah. Now, evidently, he had not been listening to Isaiah up to this point.
Right. So to set the stage a little, right, the reason that Sennacherib has destroyed all of Judah is because Hezekiah, instead of paying him off, decided to rebel, right? So here comes Sennacherib with his whole army destroying the entire land, and at this point, finally, Hezekiah realizes, "Oops, right? I probably should change my approach at this point."
Yeah. So now Isaiah sends back to him, "Say to your master, thus says the Lord." Do not be afraid. Now, we have nowadays a lot of prophetic oracles from Assyria, from around the same time. Typical thing that a prophet says to a king is, do not be afraid. So it's almost a cliche of prophecy. Mm-hmm. But do not be afraid because of the words you have heard, or the king of Assyria. I myself will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land. Now, I dare say we will come back to that one in a minute. But as to what actually happened, why did he withdraw? This is a little different from what will be suggested a little bit further on in the story. But now, is that all that he says? I think he says further down, you have a poem cited here that people point out sounds much more like 2nd Isaiah than the original Isaiah. But then, and this will be a sign for you. And this is in character, I think, for Isaiah to give a sign. This year, eat what grows of itself. In the 2nd year, what springs from that. And in the 3rd year, you shall sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah shall again take root downward and bear fruit upward.
Yeah, so it's the same image again, right? This is going to be a period of hardship. Yeah. You're going to only be able to eat what is growing on its own.
It'll be 2 years before you'll be able to plant a crop. And that, I think, is because the land has been burned so badly. So, that doesn't really suggest easy deliverance.
Sure, but it does suggest deliverance.
But it does suggest deliverance, and it suggests survival. Now, this same passage goes on. Therefore, thus says the Lord, concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, shoot an arrow there, come before it with a shield, or cast up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, he shall return, for I will defend this city. And then it says, the angel of the Lord set out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians, and taking it quite literally, I think, and when they awoke in the morning, they were all dead. That's
right. So what we can say is, for sure, the Assyrians came all the way up to Jerusalem and essentially besieged it, right? Surrounded it, and were on the verge of, could have taken it had they wanted to, probably, and left. And what we have actually is maybe 4 different explanations for it from the combination of the biblical text and Assyrian texts, right? Because the Assyrian texts also have to explain what happened here. I mean, so there's, we've got some sort of striking with the plague. We've got the rumor, which we just mentioned, right? Some notion perhaps that, there was a rebellion against Sennacherib back in the homeland, and he had to go attend to immediately, and that's what rescued. There's it's a disease, which may be like...
actually, the Greek historian Herodotus says that an Assyrian army was destroyed by a plague near the border of Egypt. Who knows? Who knows? But there were many reasons why he might have decided it wasn't worth the effort at that point.
Right. Certainly, but, as we've said, perhaps the most likely is he was simply paid off.
That he got enough out of the trip and left. This would be remembered, though, as proof of the inviolability of Zion.
Right, and I mean, as Isaiah says, God sort of takes credit, right? I defended the city. Yeah. Right. I've kept it safe. And this will be the reigning theology. It was before Isaiah, and it will be right up until the moment that it's not true anymore.
Because in the time of Jeremiah, roughly 100 years later, you'll find that what drives Jeremiah nuts is all these people saying Zion cannot be destroyed, because people then believed that God would rescue it from the Babylonians. Yeah. And he didn't.
Right, and I think that on the other side of that, the Book of Lamentations is mostly a cry of, I thought this could never happen, right? How did And so here in Isaiah at this moment, right? I think they thought this before, but this was the proof, and Isaiah makes the most of it.
So this is the ambiguity of the Zion theology, that on the one hand, it must have been a beautiful thing in its day, and given people a great sense of security to think that God was in their city and no harm could come to them. But then, when it no longer holds true, it makes for a really bitter disappointment.
Right, and this ended up being actually a terrible model. Right, Hezekiah rebelled and Jerusalem survived, and 140 years later or whatever, Zedekiah will try to do the exact same
to
thing
do the same
with
thing
utterly opposite
and
results.
disastrous results.